Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Olive, Mabel and Me, Life and Adventures with Two Very Good Dogs, by Andrew Cotter. Narrated by Andrew Cotter. Forward. Olive. I should be honest here and say that I initially wanted nothing to do with this book, as I couldn't see how it would in any way benefit me, something which I feel is quite important. But then it was explained that, firstly, I would get top billing, and secondly, the food we eat, and if you have any spare that would be great, doesn't grow on trees. I countered by pointing out that I eat most parts of trees on a regular basis. Eventually, though, I was sold on the idea that people might read it and subsequently tell me that I was a very good dog, because that pleases me. So here is our story, in words that we would choose if we knew a few more of them. But since my vocabulary stretches at most to walk, biscuit, and other assorted treats, we agreed to let Andrew write it on our behalf. I did make him promise to describe us only in glowing terms, and he said he would, although at the time he was crossing his fingers in a way that I could only envy. I have no idea why we have seen far more of him recently, which also pleases me, or why so many people are stopping us on our walks to say hello, or why he seems to be filming us more often than usual. I just know that whatever success we might have had or fame we might have achieved is entirely down to me. But in the end, I'm sure that we'll come out of the book well, because I know he loves me a lot, and, please don't tell him, I really am quite fond of him too. Mabel. Which one is Andrew again? Prologue. December 31st, 2019. The last day of the old year, and we found ourselves in Torridon, in the northwest of Scotland, which provides a landscape like no other. Rolling miles of peat and heather, studded by 1,000 lochs and pools, out of which rise giant and solitary mountains. Anchalach is perhaps the finest of them all, a sharp and imposing wedge of sandstone that can appear a fiery red in a low sun, hence the name, which in English means the forge or hearth. For the past 3 hours it had been rather more feebly illuminated by my headlamp as we made our way up the northern slopes from the edge of Little Loch Broom. But then the winter night, so long at this time of year, finally began to loosen its grip. We could see the sky in the east lighten, and silhouettes of other peaks started to form as we climbed the final slopes to the summit. And by the time we reached the ridge, the faintest glow had become the most glorious sunrise, lifting above the horizon. It was a beautiful place to see dawn on the final day of the year from the top of one of Scotland's most dramatic mountains. I was utterly captivated by the sight. The other members of our expedition were facing the other way and sniffing at something small and recently deceased. So that's us, Olive, Mabel and me, companions on many walks and in life in general. Eventually they gathered round, tempted in by bits of cheese and mini sausages, and, as we sat together, I thought about how much they meant to me, and that I was glad I had them here. Climbing mountains has always been an escape. It is for most people who head for the hills, and it certainly is for me. Getting away from the occasional madness of the world below, more often than not accompanied by my dogs. Up on the ridge of Anchalach, the three of us were offered the most incredible panorama. Behind us, to the west, the sky above the sea was still dark, but we were looking forward as the sun continued its own reluctant climb. A new year was nearly with us, and I wondered what it might bring. I wanted to stay far longer, but it was bitterly cold, and in any case the views were once again not being fully appreciated by either of my associates, who continued to forage in the never-ending Labrador quest for food. Olive now pawing optimistically at a bit of moss on the frozen ground, Mabel striking a rather richer vein within my rucksack. So we turned and headed back down to the other world and all the life and chaos and noise that it brings, with my two dogs trotting behind and none of us with any idea quite how chaotic and strange this particular New Year would be. Introduction. When asked to name your favourite year, I'm not sure that 2020 would be high on anybody's list. The CEO of Zoom might disagree, perhaps sailing around the Caribbean on his yacht pulled by a fleet of swans, but almost everybody else will have very distinct memories of the unpleasantness of it. Lockdown, lost jobs, strained relationships, and even worse. and above all, the overriding weirdness as our lives were utterly transformed by a global pandemic. For me, that feeling was only heightened by something I brought upon myself in the spring, as I somehow fashioned our entirely unwitting Labradors, Olive and Mabel, into viral stars of the internet. In my normal job, which I admit is not particularly normal, I'm a sports broadcaster, commentating on all manner of events, mainly for the BBC, but really for anybody who'll employ me. It is a hugely enjoyable profession, and one that I'm very fortunate to do, travelling around describing the action in golf, rugby, tennis, track and field, and other major events. But it does rather depend on sports actually taking place, which has never been an issue until this strange year of 2020. It was during the Six Nations rugby tournament, one of the highlights of my working year, when we started to feel that things were perhaps going slightly amiss. A couple of events had already been cancelled because of the coronavirus, which was moving from Asia into Europe to the United States and beyond. Matches in Italy and Ireland were now being called off, and there were murmurings of far worse to come. By the entirely appropriate date of Friday the 13th of March, only one fixture was left standing, Wales against Scotland. I was due to commentate and was getting ready to set off when the texts and the emails started arriving. "Game gone, give me a call," came the short, slightly harassed message from the editor. 2 minutes later, an email arrived from Augusta National Golf Club. "Unfortunately, we've decided at this time to postpone the Masters tournament." And this was quickly followed by the disappearance of the London Marathon, which would seem quite a thing to mislay. And so the sporting house of cards started to collapse. Event after event was being called off, and it didn't escape my notice that being a freelance sports commentator with no sports occurring anywhere in the world might prove tricky. Of course, for most people in that position, their immediate thought would be, can I pay bills and the mortgage? And yes, this did cross my mind. How my next thought came to be, well, perhaps I should commentate on my dogs eating their breakfast and then put it on Twitter. I'm still not quite sure. That said, ego is a fairly strong suspect. The firm belief that other people very much need to hear your voice and listen to your opinions, or indeed the desire to try and make people laugh. These are traits that are probably found more in broadcasters than other members of the human race, but most people will have them to a certain extent. That, after all, is what fuels social media, feeling the need to share. So on that fateful day, suddenly jobless, I went out, iPhone in hand, the dogs questioning why I was looking for a more scenic location than their usual feeding spot by the washing machine and the slightly grubby skirting board. Although for them, it was just another offering of food, and they would eat it by the bins if necessary. They would then try to eat from the bins. But on this occasion, they certainly wouldn't have cared or noticed that I was beside them, filming as they ate and offering a little bit more chat during their meals than I normally do. And that was it. Although in fact I did sit in the video for a couple of weeks, I wasn't initially convinced that it was riotously amusing anyway, and I tended to live by the Twitter rule, if in doubt, just don't do it. But in those next weeks, my work schedule emptied completely. The boat race, Wimbledon, the Tokyo Olympics, and the Open Championship were all either postponed or cancelled, so I was left at a very loose end. I was bored, as I wrote in the tweet which I finally decided to release into the wilds of the internet. One click, and it all began. Now, I like to think that I'm used to a reasonable amount of attention. Through my work, I have a small profile, and occasionally in the past, I might even have put out a tweet that gave 2 or 3 people the urge to type lol. But this was on an entirely different level. Within a few minutes, it had thousands of views. After an hour, 1 million. The retweets did their viral work, and the speed accelerated. The reaction was extraordinary. The next morning I woke to messages and emails from the furthest reaches of the globe. The world was suddenly looking in on and sharing our 2 dogs, who remained blissfully ignorant of the clamour, as indeed they do most things. At that point, this odd little video, which I very nearly didn't bother uploading, had racked up somewhere around 8 million views. Once you're past a few thousand, the figures become harder to comprehend, but this number is somewhere in the region of the population of London. Accompanying those views was a moderately sized town's worth of messages, and the remarkable thing was that here on Twitter, which seemed to have become a home for any number of unpleasant opinions and exchanges, those messages were all positive. How nice, I thought, as I prepared to get back to doing other things, returning to whatever it was I'd been concerned with before this video happened, and content to think of it as a one-off. Perhaps something to be laughed about in years to come, remembering that Olive and Mabel viral thing. But then, I started noticing that while the messages about the video were all grateful and generous and kind, a huge number of them also contained a question. When's the next one out? Now, another video had most assuredly not been part of the plan. I know this because there wasn't a plan. But as the days passed, the calls for a follow-up only increased. I like to imagine that this is what happens when a film has major success. The directors or actors are kicking back, having worked for months on their cherished project. It's all in the can, the premiere is a hit, and the box office takings are good. Time to enjoy the glow and settle down for a well-deserved repose on the laurels. Then comes the call from the studio executives. Nice guys, need that sequel now. I didn't really want to go anywhere near a sequel, even if it was just a minute-long video of dogs. My concern was that there was no way it could reach the audience or have the success of the first one. What if it wasn't as good? Less The Godfather Part 2 and more Police Academy 7 Mission to Moscow. With films, you know how successful they've been through various means, box office takings, critical response, etc. There might be no ticket price charged on a tweet, but you still have plenty of data to let you know how it's performed. I should add that sports broadcasters live in a world of stats and numbers. They are the measure of success for a player or team. So here are some Twitter stats for you on that first video. Dog's Breakfast, season so far. Views, 10.5 million. Retweets, 112,000. Likes, 350,000. Comments, 9,300. Resulting interview requests, 120, approx. Put like that, you can see that the pressure was building. However, reaching for analogy into another art form, we were experiencing, as one of my colleagues put it, the difficult second album. Fortunately, Olive and Mabel felt no such pressure, and delivered within a couple of weeks, emerging from their enormous trailers complete with minibars and satellite television, and deciding to have a slow, tension-filled tussle over one of their well-chewed toys. I might add that I would have regular opportunities to film this. It is a show that has been offering daily performances for some time now, and to be clear, it always follows the same script. Olive in possession of an object, Mabel deciding that said object is suddenly the only thing in the world that she has ever wanted, and to have it would make her life complete. Mabel then gets the object when Olive either becomes bored or makes a mistake, and it's all over. Until Olive goes off and selects something else to gnaw at which point the curtain rises and the show begins again. There was certainly good fortune in how it played out, with the two of them nailing their parts, Olive losing control of the rubber bone and looking, with all the sadness a Labrador can muster, into the camera at the end. Great drama and pathos, I thought, while pausing only briefly to reflect on the fact that dog commentary was apparently my life now. But this one I felt sure would get a decent reaction. And how? Within a few minutes, Game of Bones, as it became known, had taken off. If the first one was catching, the second was a new super-virulent strain. Within an hour it was doing what the first one had achieved in a day. It seemed extraordinary to me, but probably demonstrated a couple of things. Firstly, how all feelings intensified at that time. Emotions, both good and bad, were heightened during lockdown. And people just wanted to laugh at something. They wanted a distraction from lives that were becoming quite stressful. With nothing else to do and no place else to go, people were also living more and more on social media. I know I was. Usually, with a job and other things to focus upon, social media is a side issue, perhaps glanced at for a few spare minutes, sometimes not at all. But now it had become far more central to the lives of a lot of people. Apart from anything else, I wouldn't have made the video clips in our usual, normal lives. And they probably wouldn't have been taken to in quite the same way. It seemed that they had just captured the oddness of the time and the feeling that we all needed some sort of whimsical diversion. The popularity was also driven by the fact that people simply love their dogs. And during those weird weeks and months, our canine companions were needed more than ever. Dogs offer therapy at the best of times, and now in some of the worst, they really stepped up. Not that they did anything different, you understand. They just carried on being dogs, oblivious to the greater cares and stresses of the world, happy enough with a regular supply of food, a walk now and again, and somewhere comfortable to doze at regular intervals. In the meantime, my Twitter account had exploded in size and transformed in genre, from a sports-dominated following to a huge assembly who wanted more dog-based antics. Let's return once again to the sporting stats book. Game of Bones, season so far. Views, 19.7 million. Retweets, 221,000. Likes, 671,000. Comments, 14,000. In fact, if I now tweeted anything that wasn't in some way connected to dogs, I was quickly put in my place. I don't really care about golf. Olive and Mabel, please? Well, here's the confession. I am weak and easily swayed by public opinion, so I caved to the demands, and a third video followed, and another, and another. Although put like that it sounds so easy, as if the ideas simply fell from the skies, the thought and the time that was required to make a 90-second video was far more than some seem to appreciate. The inspiration-free days rolled by and turned into a couple of weeks. Where are Olive and Mabel? Was a standard inquiry that hit my inbox. For the most part these were courteously offered, but sometimes illustrated with a gif of a sulking child or a cat looking really pissed off. Again, I would love to say that I wasn't bothered, that I was quite sanguine about the whole thing, and that these people would just have to wait for the next one. Hey, I would casually shrug, there might not even be a next one. No worries at all, I'm fine with that. Not a problem. But as I said, I am weak and deeply crave the approval of total strangers. I also for some reason felt it was quite important that I should live up to the expectations of the celebrities who'd been in touch. My vivid and quite troubled imagination ran wild with the notion that Ryan Reynolds, who had given firm backing to the first video with a few laughing emojis, was now strolling round his estate, checking Twitter on his phone and furrowing his brow before deciding to let his own 16 million followers know what he thought. Still nothing new from @Mr. Andrew Cotter, and I thought he was a cool guy. #shame. Every day I'd be thinking about what I could do. A common event that kept appearing in my own Twitter feed, as I now seem to be a lightning rod for all things canine, was two dogs with a line of food in front of them, racing against each other to see who could finish first, to all-round hilarity. But that wasn't really the point of the Olive and Mabel videos. It wasn't about contriving a situation or engineering a sporting contest between the two. The whole concept so far had been dogs just being dogs, doing very normal and mundane dog things, whether it be eating or playing. That's not to say I didn't briefly try such things. Lines of food were carefully prepared in our garden. I acted alone as my partner Caroline wanted little to do with what she, quite rightly, felt was an increasing level of insanity. I would then grow frustrated when Olive started eating before I'd said go, or we had to do another take because it hadn't ended properly. Now that I think about it, Olive may have been deliberately getting things wrong. Or I would go out on our evening walk, and whereas before I'd just enjoyed throwing discs or balls for Olive and Mabel, now I was trying to create the ideal sporting contest, then getting annoyed that they hadn't delivered the perfect payoff. What was this madness? In the end, a moment did come on a walk, and it was far better than any of those planned situations. It was, as I've said, dogs just being dogs. Mabel hopped into her favourite pond for reasons known only to her, while Olive had a little think about life a few yards away. The Walk of Shame video was just as popular as the others, and only increased the calls for more. And a reminder, all you have to do is squeeze a tiny bit of pressure on me and I will fold. So yes, I put out another video. Again, it's such a short sentence, and it sounds so simple. But a huge amount of thought went into it. Each of the three so far had something different about them. A fast-paced commentary, then slower style, and then quirky. But now I wanted to break free from the sports commentary genre to try something different. As with the pond one, the inspiration struck while out walking Olive and Mabel, at the end of a day overloaded with Zoom calls, most of them outlining the extent to which we now wouldn't be employed. As I watched them both careering around a field, concentrating on simple play and sheer enjoyment, so far from our own lives of structure and work and stress, it just seemed obvious. Transplant them both into our world for a moment. And so I planned an online video conference call featuring Olive and Mabel. I was pleased with the thought of moving things on. It was a bit like a TV series that develops with time and reveals more of the characters' personality traits with each episode. Mabel showing herself here to be all too easily distracted, Olive rather more steady and dependable. Again, it was quite a simple idea, but the execution of it was a good deal more complicated. I'm sure there are some people who firmly believe that I just recorded a Zoom meeting with both of my dogs, but neither Olive nor Mabel owns a laptop or has an email address, and besides, their technical competence is limited. So the vast majority will realise that a fair amount of filming and a good number of takes and decent timing on my part were required. Then, some clever production work by a colleague of mine, Tony Maybe, to create the overall effect, and the finished product looked authentic. Even I could admit to being relatively pleased with this one, so light the fuse and stand back. Lift off. Once more it was the happy, joyful response that was most satisfying. Hundreds of people saying that they needed these dogs right now. A colleague told me that his partner had been having a dreadful time at work, and he sent me a video secretly filmed of her watching the clip after coming home, squeals of laughter filling the house. And again, Olive and Mabel were travelling far and wide. Relatives in the Netherlands sent a clip of a TV panel show introducing highlights from all the videos with subtitles. Mabel with the heavy tail use, came a voice on the breakfast eating clip as Mabel kwispelt hevig appeared at the bottom of the screen. An invitation came in from one of the major TV channels in Germany to appear on their breakfast programme called Frühstück Fernsehen, which in a pleasingly literal Germanic way translates as breakfast television. The performances of our dogs were bypassing language barriers and traversing the globe. An email arrived from Nippon TV asking if they could show the videos on their national news programme. Naturally I said yes, as I loved the idea of Japan somehow taking to the story, or perhaps developing it further into a violent game show where contestants were licked into submission by giant Olives and Mabels, as a host looked on, laughing continuously at their misfortune. Of course it was enjoyable, fun in trying to come up with the idea and to execute it properly, and gratifying to see it appreciated when it was released. It can be intoxicating, something that has more grounding in scientific fact than mere metaphor. When human beings complete a task or get some sort of approval, there is a tiny amount of a chemical called dopamine released into the brain. It offers an internal reward, which can cause an unwitting addiction. Scanning the messages that were coming in at a rate of about 1 every 3 seconds during the 24 hours following a video being put out, I was drowning in dopamine, getting dozens and dozens of little fixes, but the situation we were all in made it worse. With lockdown, I was trapped in close proximity to an iPhone or laptop, and, like a lab rat, I was just pawing away at the buttons that made me feel good. Or, rather more in keeping with the theme, I was the dog performing tricks for the reward of a biscuit. It probably wasn't the healthiest way to exist, but then none of what anybody was going through then was good for our mental equilibrium. Usually, there is a way out of scenarios like that, a release valve. More often than not, for me, it is a trip to the mountains, taking Olive and Mabel and getting away from it all. This is something I've been doing with my dogs for a good few years, and an escape that I wanted and needed more than ever during that time of lockdown. Thankfully, that way out opened up eventually, and we were able to move around again. The rest of our lives are slowly improving, and as a small but not insignificant side issue, sports have gradually begun to take place. Once more, I even find myself commentating on actual humans. I'm not saying I prefer it, but it does pay the bills. And yet, nothing will really be the same again. When I do get back to Wimbledon or the Olympics or the Masters, I firmly expect, and am quite happy, to be met with the occasional greeting of, "Hey, dog guy!" because it's part of what I do now, and let's be honest, a pretty accurate assessment of who I am. That's why I'm delighted to be given the chance to write about Olive and Mabel and our relationship, a story in a format that might not go viral, but one that we hope will bring the same joy and pleasure. After all, they will always be my 2 dogs, but Olive and Mabel now also belong to you. Andrew Cotter, Dog Guy. Chapter 1. The Dogs That Came Before. My grandparents had 13 dogs. Yes, I agree, that does seem rather excessive. Shetland sheepdogs they were, and the woolly flocks of the Shetland Islands must have been living a life of carefree abandon, as practically every member of the breed appeared to be in my grandparents' house. The reason was that they, my grandparents, not the dogs, had been chased out of Germany, my grandfather's native land, by the Russians, forced to abandon both home and livelihood. As a result, when they ended up in my grandmother's country of Scotland, they turned their hands to several ventures. They kept a pig or two, and I think the odd cow may have also been involved at some point in proceedings. For a spell, they were turkey farmers, and then finally decided to try their hand at dog breeding. I'm told that they weren't particularly successful at it, although the sheer numbers would suggest that somebody was clearly doing something right. By the time I came along, there were only about 5 sheepdogs remaining, but quite enough to be going on with, and certainly sufficient to shape a child into feeling comfortable around our canine friends, while also convincing that same child that having an entire pack of dogs in your kitchen was perfectly normal. My other grandparents had 2 West Highland Terriers, whiskery old gentlemen who seemed to live in a permanent state of being angry about something. They also just kept on going, as smaller dogs often do, becoming harder of hearing and a bit less sprightly, but pottering around until they finally departed at some indeterminate age, possibly their mid-30s. When I was the more precise age of 8, my incessant whining for a dog of my own finally paid dividends, as a Yorkshire Terrier named Humphrey arrived on my birthday. Yes, his name was spelt with an F rather than a PH, just in case you're about to fire off a stern letter to the publisher. Maverick that I am and was, I insisted upon it. Another clarification to offer is that when you mention to people that your first dog was a Yorkshire Terrier, you know they're picturing a tiny, frail creature with long hair and a bow. I can understand the mistake, because if you ever watch a dog show, then the representatives of that breed will invariably be coiffured to within an inch of their lives, with the desired size appearing to be that of some sort of rodent. Ironic, given that they were originally put to use savaging the rats of Bradford Mills. But Yorkshire Terriers bred for show bear no relation to Humphrey, a stallion-like version of the breed who was utterly fearless. I do regret that I didn't walk this stallion quite as often as I should have. It's all very strange given how much I love to stride out with my dogs now, but the early and heartfelt promises I had made that of course I would feed Humphrey and take him out every day came up against a fairly impressive opponent in the distracted nature of a child and then the overwhelming laziness of a teenager. For much of his life, I was that cliched combination of the child who loves the idea of dogs but isn't necessarily sold on the practical requirements. I liked a dog to have fun with and pet and stroke and be my very best friend forever and ever, but only if I could be bothered. If Humphrey presented me with a lead in his mouth and a hopeful expression, I might well tell him to bugger off and speak to my brother Colin, because I was in the middle of making real progress on my video game. I may have refused to do the daily mundane walks, but I did turn up like some glory-seeking actor in the big scenes for the truly adventurous expeditions, of which there were many. Indeed, some photos from childhood show the first intertwining of 2 of my major loves, dogs and mountains. Perhaps mountain is an ambitious description for Loudon Hill in East Ayrshire, but it would have seemed like Kanchenjunga to an 11-week-old Humphrey. Then there is a photo at the top of Goat Fell on the Isle of Arran, where we spent many a summer holiday. In it, my exhausted mother is flanked by Humphrey and her own Shetland sheepdog, Peary, who is 95% hare. Both of them fresh as a daisy, having galloped up and down the near 3,000 feet, the equivalent of half a dozen times. I'm sure they were also there on Ben Lomond, the most southerly of the Munros, and the first one I climbed, as it is for most people from the southwest of Scotland. Note, Munro is the name given to a mountain in Scotland more than 3,000 feet in height, or 914.4 metres. It comes from Sir Hugh Munro, a founding member of the Scottish Mountaineering Club, who drew up the list in 1891. With occasional promotions and demotions over the years due to more precise measurements, the list now stands at 282 peaks. Often, in the snapshots of those days, Humphrey is seen with a rather rakish 1980s fringe draped over one eye, like a canine Simon Le Bon. On other occasions, he sports a more brutalist style, when my mother had obviously had enough and found some scissors. But both he and Peary threw themselves into life and seemed to enjoy everything enormously. It's no surprise, then, that a good number of photos of my childhood feature a dog, often me and my two older brothers, Stephen and Colin, with a furry beast nearby. One of my favourites is of our first Shetland sheepdog, Kelpie, coveting a small cake held temptingly in my 18-month-old hand, but dogs were always there in roles of varying prominence, lurking in the background, busying themselves with some matter of great importance, or even just offering the edge of a nose, poking into a shot. Very occasionally they would be front and centre of the group, posing in noble fashion and appearing to be cooperating fully with proceedings, but really being held there against their will with a firm hand, or bribed to stay in place with a subtly located biscuit.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?